Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. And today we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and we're going to dive right in today, and we're going to look at headlines that are coming up on my news blog that I am reviewing as I sit here with you. So the first series is this is interesting. This is from the New Voice of Ukraine. Obviously, this is a pro-Ukrainian site, and it says or news service, and it states Dutch foreign minister says Netherlands may transfer F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. Interesting. New York Post. CIA chief held secret meetings with Ukraine's Zelensky on Russian moves. Coming out of the Defense Post, France to boost defense spending by a third. Interesting. That's a hefty increase in defense spending. U.S. approves delivery to Ukraine of 59 additional Bradley fighting vehicles, M2A2 IFVs, and 90 Stryker APCs. Europe prepared to provide heavy tanks to Ukraine as pressure ramps up on Germany to provide. U.S. calls for allies to dig deeper on Ukraine as pressure builds for tanks. U.S. wants the Europeans to offer more weapons and equipment to the Ukrainians. NATO Secretary General in Ramstein. We must urgently step up support for Ukraine. Urgently. What's happening on the ground that has the Secretary General making such statements as must urgently step up support? And this was a very, very interesting bit of information. Russia strengthens protection of Ministry of Defense buildings with air defense systems. So there has been video footage, pictures that have been taken in Moscow where the Russians have placed air defense systems on the top of key buildings inside of Moscow. Additionally, there's also been photographs taken of S-400s, S-300s being repositioned closer to the center of Moscow as well. What are they preparing for? Are they preparing for the possibility of a Ukrainian cruise missile strike, drone strike on Moscow, which at this point is very probable, highly likely an attempt at some point could be made by the Ukrainians? Again, I believe that the situation on the ground in terms of what is happening with the Ukrainian war effort, I believe at this point things are starting to get desperate for the Ukrainians. I think the Ukrainians have done a very good job in propagandizing this conflict and giving the perception that maybe they're doing better than they really are. And I think the media in general has done that as well here in the West. Now, at the same time, I also believe that the Russian forces have underperformed again, going into this conflict with the Russian strategy of a rapid move on Kiev. These were some very daring operations. The airborne landing at Hostomel, northwest of Kiev. Again, if that operation would have been successful and the Russian plan would have worked, this would have gone down in military history as again probably a very aggressive operation that that ended a war very, very quickly. But unfortunately for the Russians, the Ukrainians resisted, and they resisted much at a much higher degree than the Russians anticipated. And compounding that, as we knew going into this conflict, the United States was feeding the Ukrainians real-time intelligence. So the Ukrainians knew where the Russians were coming. They knew the strength and composition of Russian forces, and the Ukrainians were able to reposition. They were able to move forces. At the same time, the United States quickly injected the Ukrainian military with some rather advanced armaments as well. Now, if that were to not have happened, would we possibly have seen a different outcome? I don't believe we would have. I believe that at least in the initial stages of the conflict, especially the fighting that took place around Kiev, the tenacity of the Ukrainian defenders against Russian forces would have made it very, very difficult for the Russians to occupy Kiev. The Russians may have been able to seize control of Hostomel. They may have been able to then possibly land those airborne forces into the airport. But ultimately, then moving those forces and seizing control of Kiev with the amount of resistance that was in Kiev, I think ultimately the Russians would have met with defeat. And now, with that being said, I do believe that if the Russians would have changed its strategy, changed its plan, prepared for what they were facing, then maybe the outcome would have been a bit different. Not so much as the success, the immediate success within the first 30 days of the conflict, but what I mean is that where we sit now, if the Russian strategy had been a bit different and had anticipated this robust, tenacious defense by the Ukrainians, the Russians could have adapted. They could have also prepared better for said conflict. But again, unfortunately for the Russians, that didn't happen, and they are sitting where they're sitting now. What else do we have here? Let's see. We've got the CIA chief, secret meetings. Kremlin says West will regret delusion that Ukraine can win on the battlefield. And again, that just goes to show you that, and I don't think this has set in yet with the West. I think the West is still treating this like that at some point the Russians are just going to pack their bags and go home. They're not going to do that. It doesn't appear that they're going to do that, and they appear to be settling in for the long haul. And this is going to be quite possibly a very lengthy war that is only going to eventually escalate. I think at this point, the Russians see the United States, they see Western Europe, NATO, as a terminal enemy. And they have to, the Russians, have to remove that terminal enemy from Ukraine. And quite possibly, whereas the Russians may have uh, probably 30, 60 days once hostilities started, may have changed their calculation, may have changed their war goals, their war aims, and probably were not looking to then occupy Kiev. Maybe now the Russians quite possibly could be changing again their war goals and war aims. It's possible. Again, I think the initial war goal, war aim of the Russians was to move in very rapidly, very aggressively. And again, if it would have worked, it would have been one hell of an operation, but it didn't. And then the Russians took another look at its war goals, its war aims, reduced those war goals, war aims to quite possibly the Donbass region, the land corridor, and maybe Kharkov. I think now, presently, the Russians are reviewing that they may have to, in fact, take all of Ukraine. At the very least, right now, I believe the Russian war effort is to take all territory east of the Dnieper River. This river here, east of this area. But given what's happening now on the ground in Russia, the mobilization, the military-industrial mobilization that we're seeing, we may see the Russians eventually look to expand this operation if in fact we're looking at a multi-year war, which we could be. Again, the Russians are just not going to pack up and go home. There may be a ceasefire, there may be a lull in the fighting, but ultimately, given the cost of this campaign and what has happened, I think the Russian military apparatus, the current body politic in the Kremlin, has decided that it needs complete regime change in Ukraine. And if that is complete occupation of Ukraine, well, they're going to do it. Or they're going to try to do it. The United States obviously continues to provide a lot of equipment, a lot of money, a lot of dollars. But how long is that going to last? Look, the United States is over $30 trillion in debt. We're having a debt cap crisis right now in the United States, where they're going to raise the debt ceiling again. And how long can we do that here in the United States? While at the same time ramping up our military-industrial complex to fight a major ground war in Europe, which we're essentially financially fighting right now. And it's going to continue to be very expensive, and then quite possibly, worst case scenario, as I've talked about before, expand into Western Europe. You could see fighting between the Russians and the Poles, fighting possibly Russians, Romanians, Moldova. There's many different ways this could turn south. What if there is a Russian attack or something happens on the open ocean? A Russian submarine launches an operation against a NATO vessel. That sort of operation. We're seeing right now the conflict take place very much isolated in Ukraine. But if this thing really lets loose, it would go global, obviously. And that's the big concern. And I think right now the United States is tempering some of its options in terms of handing over some of this equipment to the Ukrainians, especially some of these more longer range systems to the Ukrainians. The United States seems to be hesitant about providing obviously the M1A2 main battle tank. I'm not so sure that is an issue with making the Russians angry. I'm not sure what else the United States can do to make the Russians even more angrier. I don't think providing those main battle tanks would. I think it's simply a logistical issue. The cost of providing those main battle tanks to the Ukrainians in terms of having to train hundreds, thousands of personnel in the upkeep of those main battle tanks, and then have those main battle tanks operate in the area of Ukraine could be challenging for the Ukrainians. Very heavy tank. You have issues with bridges, roadways, just like we're seeing now, even just with tanks operating in this very very muddy terrain that we're seeing. So it's difficult to say if that's the reason why the United States is not providing that equipment to the Ukrainians. It's probably not about making Russia angry. It's about just logistically, it's cost versus benefit, and what's the real benefit of supplying those heavy main battle tanks, other than the Ukrainians appear to want them. But ultimately, they may want them, but is it going to be effective in their military campaign? Probably not. Not on the scale, at least, in which they would initially be delivered to the Ukrainians. But again, we will continue to monitor. We will continue to report. We'll zoom in here real quick. Again, most of the fighting right now is taking place near Bakhmut, near Soledar. The Russians are continuing this localized operation, which appears to want to envelop Bakhmut, seize control of Bakhmut. And then the question is what is next? Difficult to say at this point. So we'll continue our coverage. Thank you for joining us today. As always, have a good day.